Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm talking with my dear friend Dr. Gregory Popcak, who runs CatholicCounselors.com. He's the founder of it. Together with his bride Lisa, he's the author of over 20 popular books, host of More to Life, heard each day at 10 a.m. on EWTN Catholic Radio. They're also the founders of the CatholicHOM app that provides couples and parents with the coaching and resources they need to build strong domestic churches. Catholic Home Network. Greg, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great, Marcus. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always a joy to reconnect with you, and I'm really glad to be able to spend this time with you to talk about something that's very important, which is what parents have been trained to get wrong.
Yes.
Now, Greg, I think I was always led to believe that the moment you have a child, you know how to parent.
Oh, wow. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. For about 70 years, parents have been programmed to think of parenting strictly as a series of techniques that we use on kids. And this comes from folks who might remember Dr. Spock. I don't mean Spock from Star Trek. I mean Spock, the pediatrician. Yeah, who used behaviorism as the framework for his parenting advice. Now, behaviorism, for folks, if you want to go back to your Psych 101 class in college, was something that many people contributed to, but in particular, B.F. Skinner was the guy who was kind of the father of modern behaviorism. And he wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And his point was that let's not worry about all this stuff that goes on inside the brain or the dignity of the person or all this nonsense. You can just manipulate people by rewards and punishments. And you can stop them from doing bad things by punishing them, and you can get them to do good things by rewarding them. And Dr. Spock, the pediatrician, used this framework to kind of teach parents how to parent. And it became wildly successful because he was one of the first popular parenting authors at the time. And so from that framework, though, parents just kind of got, four or five generations of parents now have gotten the information that parenting is not a relationship you build with children. It's a series of techniques you use on kids. And so what you end up with is even parents who, for example, are trying to use things like attachment parenting approaches like breastfeeding or baby wearing or co-sleeping, they tend to ask, well, how long do I have to do this? Or when do I know I can stop? Because they see it as a technique that I use on my kid to try to get certain things out of them. I want to produce a good kid by doing the right techniques, as opposed to saying, well, I'm going to do this as long as my child needs it. And when I can wean them off of it, then I will. But it's going to be that relationship, that back and forth that tells me when it's time to stop doing this thing or whether to do this thing and it's working or not. Like parents will often say, well, I did all the things, but my kid is still misbehaving. Well, again, I'm imposing techniques on my child rather than seeing the relationship and seeing, is what I'm doing having an effect, and do I need to adjust my approach to get a different effect? We have a tendency to want the checklist that tells us what to do. And if I'm doing the checklist, then I'm doing a good job as a parent, even if what I'm doing isn't working. And so our whole ministry really, whether we're talking through the Catholic Home app, or on More to Life, or through CatholicCounselors.com, is really reminding parents, especially Catholic parents, that Catholic parenting is not about manipulating children into virtue with techniques or punishments or rewards. It's about mentoring and discipling our kids into a Christian way of thinking and living that requires relationship. And that's something that that the church has always taught, and St. John Bosco in particular, in his educational philosophy, really encouraged not heavy-handed punishments and manipulation, but rather reason, religion, and loving kindness were his three pillars for building relationships with his students. And so we encourage Catholic parents to use that approach in family life as well.
B.F. Skinner and the entire school of behaviorism, if you could speak to, because it's a very popular school of psychology in terms of parenting application even today. Could you please speak to the kind of ethical framework that was being employed, Greg? So in other words, it doesn't comport with how the scriptures and the Christian revelation encourage us to think about our ethics when working with children.
Well, that's right. Yeah. So again, B.F. Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, contrast that with, say, St. John Paul's book, Love and Responsibility, right? The idea
Mm,
that B.F. Skinner used this set of criteria. Well, let's forget about freedom and dignity and all that nonsense. Let's just talk about manipulating people by doing good, either punishing them for doing bad things or rewarding them for doing good things. But St. John Paul is really talking about love being the only logical response to a human person. And that includes children, right? That we have to enter into relationship with them. We have to walk with them. We have to understand what they're trying to do and teach them how to do that better. We have to acknowledge the good intentions that they have, but then say, well, here's a better way to approach this situation, or here's how you can express yourself here. And it's about walking alongside of them and teaching them and supporting them and loving them, as opposed to manipulating them. And the funny thing happens when Catholic parents try to use these more behavioral approaches. What it comes down to is we basically try to manipulate our kids into being virtuous, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because you can't manipulate somebody and you can't use an unvirtuous way of bringing virtue
mm.
out of another person. And the thing is, behaviorism works well enough that it's a little bit like you pull the lever on the slot machine, and every once in a while you hit, and so you think, well, this is the way to make money. Manipulating people works well enough that we think, well, we should just do that. But it tends to run out. So I'll get parents all the time who'll say, I've tried all the things and nothing's working. And it's because they've tried all the techniques, but they've never actually developed a relationship with their kid. And we are programmed by God not to be manipulated, to be loved as persons, as St. John Paul reminded us, and to rebel when we feel like we're being treated like a project. And that's true even in our children. When our children feel like we're trying to manipulate them, or we're trying to turn them into something, that we want them to be, as opposed to what God's calling them to be, they're going to push back. And we experience that as rebellion. And so we then pile on more techniques and more consequences and more rewards and more charts in a way to kind of manipulate them into being who we want them to be more, which then causes them to defy us even harder, because they don't want to be a project. They want to be a person. And so if we can kind of step off of that gerbil wheel and start recognizing, my kid isn't out to get me. My kid doesn't want to be rebellious. They just want to be seen as a person. And once I can help parents do that, it's kind of amazing to see the kind of change that happens. But we have to stop buying into this idea that parenting is a series of techniques that we impose on our kids, and start seeing it as a relationship that we build with our children.
Can you also share about how, unfortunately, because of how ubiquitous something like Skinner and behaviorism's techniques are, even well-meaning Catholic parents can fall into it, like you just mentioned, or the narrative out there that children are X, or I have to do Y in order to get Z. Children are this burden, and so if I do this, I will get this result out of it, and the pathway forward from there.
Well, again, and it took me a long time to realize this, because, for example, our approach has always been more relational. And then we would get a lot of pushback from parents who would read our parenting books and say, well, how long do I have to do this? Or why do I have to do this? Or how often do I have to do this? It would be like if I wrote a marriage book, and we've written several marriage books, but if I wrote a marriage book and people were saying, well, just tell me how many times a day I have to hug my wife to get her to do, I mean, that kind of misses the point, right? What kind of consequences can I use on my wife to make her behave? What kind of rewards do I need to give my wife to make her do what I want her to do? When you see it in that way, it's kind of warped, and because children can't verbalize the frustration they feel about being manipulated, we think it's okay to do it. But of course it's not. So that we have to kind of step back, and the approach that we recommend is this discipleship discipline approach that enables us to say, okay, you know what, my kid isn't out to manipulate me, and I'm not going to manipulate them. They're trying to meet needs. They're trying to solve problems. When their behavior frustrates me, I have to recognize that there's an intention or a need behind that behavior. Let's figure that out together. What was this kid trying to do? How can I teach them to do it better? Right? So the child is disrespectful. All right. So, okay, I understand that you're upset. Here's how you can tell me that you're upset in a way that's respectful. Or, you're frustrated with your sister. Here's how you can work that problem out and learn and be able to share that toy instead of taking the toy from her. But we identify the intention. We validate that intention and say, okay, I appreciate what you're trying to do. Here's how you can do it better. And the funny thing about that is, because that kind of correction is actually helpful to the child, they come closer to us because of that correction. They appreciate getting the advice and the help they need to do what they are trying to do more efficiently and effectively. And I remember there was one time where my two oldest kids were fighting with each other, and they were probably about 12 and 10 at the time. And instead of just telling them to knock it off or giving them a punishment, I actually sat them down and I said, okay, help me understand what it is that you're trying to say to each other. And I kind of walked them through it. It took all of 5 minutes, And at the end of it, they actually thanked me, for helping them figure this out, instead of just telling them to go work it out yourselves or stop annoying your sister, or, and so the kind of correction that allows us to come alongside of our kids, identify the intention and teach them how to do it better, actually draws them closer to us and helps them feel more effective and raises them ultimately to be virtuous Christian people.
My guest has been Dr. Gregory Popcak. We've been talking about what parents have been trained to get wrong and how virtue and working with discipleship parenting can actually help us get it right. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.